Good morning. This is Rabbi Moshe Otero, as we will be continuing this morning through the book To Be a Jew. We ended in the last video regarding the Havdalah, which basically concludes Shabbat. But now we need to understand what are things that are prohibited or tasks that are prohibited on Shabbat itself. So let's take a look at this. And those of you who are reading your book, you can take a look at it on page 89, To Be a Jew. We're going to look at some forbidden tasks on Shabbat, things that are not supposed to be done during Shabbat. By the biblical law, we read in the Ten Commandments as well as elsewhere in the Torah, Israel is repeatedly cautioned against performing any manner of Melachah, translated as work. You will do no work on Shabbat. Now, what does that mean? What does that entail? I mean, if I pick up the whole entire furniture here on Shabbat, am I working on Shabbat? If I, for example, do the dishes on Shabbat, am I working on Shabbat? So in the Ten Commandments, as well as elsewhere in the Torah, Israel is repeated not to do work or melachah on Shabbat. Not only are there negative commandments, you shall not do any melachah or work, neither you nor your sons nor your daughters. Exodus chapter 20, verse 10, and Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 12 through 14. But there's also a positive commandment to sanctify the day, to make it holy, and to remember it, to observe it, to rest on it, as it says in Exodus chapter 23, verse 12. The Hebrew concept and definitions of melachah, or work, is not identical with what it means in English by the word work. It's therefore preferable that we either use the Hebrew term consistently or simply refer it to the task forbidden on Shabbat. There are tasks that are not forbidden on Shabbat, and some people would consider them work. So let's get down to the basics. So when we talk about work, it generally implies either an activity that one does in the course of one's employment, profession, or occupation, or an activity that involves great physical exertion. Neither of these definitions from the underlying basis is really for what constitutes melachah according to the Torah. If it did, and work meant refrain only from such activities that come under either of these two categories, Shabbat rest would obviously differ for every person. It would be relative. What one does gainfully, another does for leisure. What one enjoys, another detests. What is hard for one is easy for another. And according to such definition, a rabbi or a teacher should not be permitted to give any instructions on Shabbat, and should not be permitted to give any instructions or clarifications or even work on Shabbat, as he is fulfilling his duties on Shabbat. So to move heavy burdens from one spot to another in one's home, is that prohibited? Is that work? Yet neither of these activities are forbidden as melachah. Furthermore, on the basis of such definition of work, Shabbat, rest loses all of its spiritual significance and implication. Now, the oral law, which we hold by as well, we have the written or biblical, as well as the oral law. What Scripture means by the term melachah, it specifically sets forth the task or activity prohibited under this category. It does not leave up to each person to define for himself what should be or what constitutes melachah, work. If it did, there might well be no Sabbath law at all. Any law or any legal system that is vague or obscure, which can be interpreted in a way that sees fit to one and not to the other. It becomes a useless law and serves no purpose. Since this is purpose for Shabbat, there are definite spiritual aims to be reached, as well as spiritual concepts to be stressed. The Torah delineation as such does not constitute melachah and the key understanding of appreciating and observing the Sabbath. The mere development of modern technology with its new instruments, with its new machines, with its new items, which were unknown when the Torah was given or when the sages lived in Talmudical times, does not automatically make Shabbat laws obsolete. On the contrary, a law that is alive, it goes by daily application. The Shabbat laws can be rendered obsolete if that were the case. On the contrary, it's a law that's alive, and Jewish law has always been and continues to be a living law, and has within itself a built-in power and creativity that enables the judges of the law to continually keep and apply the law to new conditions. New conditions and circumstances are continually being judged on the basis of legal principles and the concepts of which law rests. Now there's new developments and thus continually brought into the framework of the Torah commandments. If that had not been the case, Judaism would have perished a long time ago. The theoretical concepts and points have perished a long time ago, or rather it points to the law that enables rabbis to render judgment, as well as some new developments which is either permitted or forbidden according to the Torah, be it in question pertaining to the Shabbat or any other area. Obviously it requires great study. It suffices for us to say that the authority in such matters is based on the passage of what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 9 through 11. And you shall come to the judge that shall be in those days, and you shall do according to the tenor of the sentence. You shall observe to do according to all that they teach you. So here we have the idea of oral law being instructed to the population or the congregation of Israel according to the days in which they live. What used to be done centuries ago may not be done nowadays, or vice versa. The Mishnah in Shabbat 7 verse 2 lists 39 categories activities regarding Melachah. These are the 39 areas of prohibition that we will be reviewing in this chapter very briefly, but you will need to go into it a little bit further as to exactly what are the specifics on those. So that's a little bit of a homework I'm going to be giving you. These, as well as other tasks that operate on the same principles or have similar purpose, are forbidden on the Shabbat based on biblical law. Now, there's some common activities that are forbidden on Shabbat because they constitute Melachah, and as defined by the Torah, it includes areas like cooking, baking, even if it does not involve lighting a fire, grinding, fine chopping, straining, washing clothes by hand or by machine, knitting, crocheting, embroidering, sewing, pasting or gluing, constructing or repairing the entire of the building operations or household repair task. Writing or erasing is also a prohibitive activity. Painting, typing, coloring are areas in which the prohibition exists. Hair cutting, cutting your hair, shaving, paring your nails, all of that on Shabbat are prohibited. Kindling fire or extinguishing a fire, starting a fresh fire or lighting a fire from another already burning, making a fire larger or smaller by poking or adding or drawing off fuel, wood, oil, paper, or mechanical control of the knobs, lighting a candle, striking a match or a lighter, smoking. Yes, even smoking on Shabbat is prohibited. Cutting or tearing, this does not apply obviously to cutting of food. Fishing or trapping, garden care or lawn maintenance, digging, planting, fertilizing, weeding, cutting and trimming, mowing, picking fruits or plucking flowers or leaves or watering even if the plant is indoors. Carrying or pushing or moving an object more than 6 feet within a public domain or from a private domain into a public domain and vice versa. So these are considered 39 melachas that's prohibited on Shabbat. In this I want you all to go and study the specific areas that you'll find in your book in page 90, because it not only carries the idea of the Melachah, but you have subcategories of that as well. Shabbat stove. Prohibition of cooking does not mean that we may eat only cold food on Shabbat. On the contrary, Shabbat is considered complete. Is not considered complete without some hot food. Now, the result is achieved by a Shabbat stove. That means that the stove is arranged before Shabbat as follows. A sheet of tin or aluminum or any metal conductor or heat is placed over the burners, which they lit before Shabbat as a moderate or low flame, low temperature if electric, and allowed to remain on throughout Shabbat. Hot cooked foods and urn of hot water or tea kettle cooked before Shabbat and is allowed to remain on the stove from the day of Shabbat, and the heat is so adjusted as to keep them hot during Shabbat until needed. Now, rabbinical law. Let's take a look at the rabbinical law. The rabbis and sages exercising their responsibility to safeguard the Torah's laws from being unwittingly and carelessly, unintentionally violated the enactment of protective legislation, which is really a fence around the written laws, which are binding upon us as it is Torah itself. Although the violation of these gezerot, which are additional rabbinical prohibitions, obviously are of less severity, these gezerot were designed to forbid those activities. It resembled melachos in practice, being readily confused with a biblical forbidden task, and thus easily leading to the latter melachah, the violation of Shabbat laws. Invariably also involves the actual melachot, which is experientially shown that they actually lead to the doing of a melachah itself, a prohibited task. Now, some of the common activities forbidden on Shabbat by rabbinical laws are such things as buying and selling. This was condemned long before the Hebrew prophets as a violation of Shabbat. The idea of negotiating deals on Shabbat is prohibited. Riding an animal. What's wrong with riding an animal? I'm having a leisure time. That's prohibited by rabbinical law. Boating, getting on a boat. Playing a musical instrument. But wait a minute, Rabbi, you said boating or going on a cruise ship. But what if I'm already on a cruise ship during the week? Well, this is where there are ways around that when the majority of the people on the boat are not Jewish, and in fact you are on the boat. But we'll get into that a little bit later on more of a one-on-one situation. Playing a musical instrument on Shabbat. Switching and on and off electric lights for any electrical apparatus such as radio, telephone, television. Some scholars classify this as a prohibition of deoraita because it's derived from a biblical law. However, these timing devices before Shabbat may be used to turn off and on the electricity and controls according to the automation of an elevator on Shabbat. There's also different points of view, whether turning on the light is considered turning on fire, or is it electric and not considered fire. But again, there are various different opinions regarding this. So switching on and off electric apparatuses are considered prohibitive, at least from a rabbinical level. Handing of any of these items for use is considered forbidden on Shabbat, such as tools, money, writing instruments, various electrical gadgets or machines, candles, matches, money, purses, such items which are considered to be of no use on Shabbat because it would lead into breaking one of the laws of Shabbat. These areas are called, please remember this term, muksa. Muksa means it has no meaning, it has no value. If it has no value, then you shouldn't be utilizing on Shabbat. It's set aside or excluded from Shabbat's use and handling. Wedding ceremonies. We do not perform wedding ceremonies on Shabbat. Journey on Shabbat, even on foot, beyond a certain limit, approximately 3/4 of a mile, beyond the limits of a town or place which one is spending on Shabbat. The limit is known as Shabbat boundaries, or Tehum Shabbat. This is because the spirit of Shabbat is essentially restful. Also shunned are such activities which are not Melachah by biblical definitions, and that are not activities which may lead to them, by which, in the opinions of the sages, constitute a weekday task. In other words, a ma'aseh chol, something that you do during the week, which distracts from the sanctity of the day of Shabbat. Kedushat hayom. Examples of such activities are in the categories of heavy jobs, such as rearranging the furniture in the house, watching television even when preset before Shabbat, preparing for the post-Shabbat activities, engaging in exercise or athletic activities, reading business correspondence. Although they're not prohibited, these items are things that it's done during the week and therefore are highly discouraged. Shabbat restrictions as applied to the children. Here we have a lot of challenges. Although the very young kids or young children need not to be prevented from engaging in any forbidden Shabbat activity, parents should not encourage them to do so, but such as asking them to carry or tear or put a light on them should also be not done as you're training the child to break Shabbat in those activities. As soon as the child is capable of understanding, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, he should be retrained from engaging in any forbidden Shabbat activity. The example set by parents is the best teacher. A simple, quiet reminder, not a harsh rebuke, is the proper way of dealing with forgetfulness. Since Shabbat should be related to the children in mind, the spirit of joy and the sense of excitement when getting dressed up and being taken to the synagogue with special treats and cakes and tables and hymns and kiddush and havdalah. With this is assured the presence of his parents and the greater attention that gets showered upon. With all of these things of delightful of the soul of a child, the restrictions are not even felt by the burdensome limitation to the joyous childhood activity, but rather as a natural and acceptable replacement of one such set of activities by another, and more delightful and set of activities. Now, one word about another area which has to do with automobiles. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nehiyah b'dvarim. Of all the technological developments of the 20th century, the issue of automobiles in Shabbat has emerged on as a particular cause célèbre, and as a cause and a central problem for Judaism in modern life. But among traditional Jews, there's no problem at all. The fact is that contemporary rabbinical authorities have unanimously ruled that driving of a motor vehicle constitutes Melachah, and that involves in tasks which in essence are forbidden by the Torah. Unlike other rabbinical rules or rulings on which they may be differ of judgment, no competent rabbinical authority, no religious scholar has ever disputed this ruling. As judgment goes, it was relatively clear-cut and simple and almost self-evident. And the reason because automobiles is a combustion engine that in order to get it moving, it requires an ignition, which is a spark of fire. And we know where that is derived from. And it's noted that the current extension of ancient rabbinical rules, which prohibits riding on an animal on Shabbat, as often assumed by the masses, by the ruling of automobiles, has nothing in common with the ruling on riding of animals, and in fact, a much greater violation. Whereas the prohibition of riding an animal is merely and clearly a rabbinic enactment intended to serve as a fence around the Torah. The prohibition of driving is an extension of the biblical prohibition of kindling fire and burning. Creating sparks and burning gas and oil as a direct result of the driver's actions are but a few and more serious objections. However, with technology, there's innovation. And so what's being discussed today in a lot of circles is this idea of a battery-operated or electric car, which goes back into whether electricity is fire or not, and it goes into this area in which whether it's permissible to take an electric car and go to shul. So think about this for a moment. The majority already are going against it because they're already accustomed to the old way of thinking. But with this new technology, which you're not turning on fire, Could it be possible that one day we'll see people driving to shul in an electric car, or being taken to shul in an electric car, although they may not be driving? So these are things to ponder. But the majority of the rabbis who are involved in these type of discussions will obviously look for a way to prohibit what may be permissible. It is interesting to note that those who are Shabbat observers have never objected or revolted against this judgment. Those whom it is popular and who find it difficult to observe are those whose entire way of life does generally not include Shabbat, except perhaps for attending the synagogue. But the Shabbat is much more than just going to service. It's an experience. Objections comes from all of those who are totally not Shabbat observers, usually the non-observant person will look for any way to try to justify not having to keep these laws which were given from God to Moses and to the children of Israel. And those who self-righteously proclaim that there is an inability to get to the synagogue unless they drive there. Basic justification. Oh, I got to get to shul, but it's too far away from me, and therefore I have to drive there. This is why it becomes important for the person who becomes Jewish be close to a community or to a minyan where he or she can assist. The indifference created a problem for this problem, except for rabbinical authority, to sanction their transgression on the theory that it will enable them to do a mitzvah, to attend the shul, the synagogue, and to pray to the Almighty. Stay home. If you don't have the means to be able to walk to shul, stay home and pray to God there as you would at the shul or at the synagogue. Our sages long ago enunciated the principle that when a mitzvah is performed by committing a transgression and of avera, such a mitzvah is not acceptable in the sight of God. This principle is keeping with the entire spirit of the Hebrew prophets. A Shabbat observer to whom the entire Shabbat day is precious would it be the first place to consider establishing his permanent residence in an area where there is no synagogue within reasonable walking distance. Such a person might consider proximity or the quality of a local school or public transportation or convenience shopping or condition of moving into a new area. The Shabbat observer adds the additional condition of a nearby synagogue, where it would be at walking distance, whereby forces, circumstances, Shabbat observers are compelled to move out of established neighborhoods into newly developed areas, like most other Jews who tend to choose areas where they know that there are other Jews or will soon be living other Jews. But instead of thinking in these terms of driving to their old house of worship, they are set about organizing a new congregation or minyan of neighborhoods with people whom to pray with. So the Jew is always innovative. There's no synagogues around me? You build one, and they will come. Surely the social desire to worship with old friends and to retain membership is in a prestigious congregation in the established neighborhood is to listen to a favorite rabbi or cantor, and with economic consideration of paid-up building contributions, do not justify the desecration of Shabbat and the violation of the commandment of the Lord. Shabbat observers who occasionally find himself or herself at a great distance from a synagogue on Shabbat when he's vacationing or traveling can succeed in creating for himself a Shabbat atmosphere, Shabbat calm, Shabbat rest, no matter where he or she is in. And by observing the ritual laws of Shabbat as outlined, saying the Shabbat prayers privately, to think that one can, however, manage to be without a synagogue or Shabbat on a permanent basis and still retain the full quality of Shabbat experience would be a grave error of judgment. It isn't better to drive to shul than to not go at all, is often asked question. Well, Rabbi, isn't it better for me to drive to shul on Shabbat than not go at all? And this is a very often asked question. And if the questioner would really mean that, isn't it better for me to drive to shul or synagogue, thereby committing only one major transgression, and spend a few proper hours in the spirit of Shabbat instead of driving to the business or shopping or some other recreational areas, instead of staying home and mowing the lawn, tending the garden, repairing the house? then obviously what the rabbi is being asked is to choose between the lessers of two evils. He really is being asked whether it is better to commit just one of many Shabbat violations during a certain time period, and the rabbi cannot permit even one. I can't even justify that, as it is not he, but the Torah that forbids it, even though it is quite obvious that it is preferable to perform a few transgressions rather than more. That is always preferable to be guilty of fewer violations of the Shabbat rather than more. And it's true. Isn't it a better judge to run just one red light instead of speeding and making improper turns and running 10 red lights? Would be the parallel of the sort of question that's being asked of a rabbi to decide for the parishioner, for the attendee that wants to be part of a shul, wants to be part. So try to do everything you can to be close to a community. And through this, the punishment, though the punishment is less than if it were convicted of many violations or multiple counts. But what the question is really asking, what it means is, isn't it better for me to drive to shul on Shabbat, there to join the congregation in public worship instead of staying home and worshiping alone and thereby observing Shabbat in deed and in spirit? Then answer is no. Stay at home if you're not in walking distance of a shul and it's too much of a burden for you to go to shul and it takes 2-3 hours just to get there, and by the time you get there, services is over. Stay home and learn to daven in your home, and perhaps other people in your area are also Jewish and you can invite them over for a minyan or for Shabbat meal. Suspension of Shabbat rules. When a person's life is in danger, and this has got to be understood, was man made for Shabbat or Shabbat made for man? Obviously this question comes down even over 2,000 years ago, and it was asked again, is man preferable, is over Shabbat or Shabbat over man? In other words, who has the preferential treatment here? If a life of a human being is in danger, do we still keep Shabbat? Do we still keep to this rule which many times bind and may cause harm to us? When a person's life is in danger, it is the duty to do whatever is necessary to save the life. Shabbat laws are suspended in matters of serious illness or in any situation in which a person's life is at stake. It's called Pekuach HaNefesh. Your soul, your life is at stake. A physician called upon to render emergency treatment may do all that is necessary to save a life without regards to Shabbat's restriction. Some people try to go around and bow, well, I'm going to try to not break Shabbat, but I need to get to the hospital. So I'm going to try to, hide behind the curtains like I'm not breaking Shabbat, but I have to. Break Shabbat. It's a mitzvah to do so. It's to save your life or the life of a human being. For heaven's sake. You know your relationship with God. You say, God, I got to do this because if not, I may die, my spouse may die, something may happen, and I got to take care of this. I'm sorry, God, but I have to take this, my life, the life of a loved one. The famous dictum comes to play very easily. The Shabbat was given over to man and not man to Shabbat. I know many of you have heard this before in other literatures, that man takes preference, and it was not given, as it says here, man over to Shabbat, but rather Shabbat to man. So Shabbat was given over to man so he could enjoy and be a blessing, and not the man to be a slave to the Shabbat, that he can't do anything because in the case of health issues, he's bound to die on Shabbat. No, my friends. This was never intended to be exploited as a pretext for catering to one's physical and recreational pleasure, nor as a rationale of abrogating or evading Shabbat laws altogether. As it says in Yoma, and here we conclude this chapter 5 as a summary, desecrate one Shabbat so that he may live to fulfill many Shabbatot, or many Shabbat. Yoma 86a. And with that, we conclude this chapter of Shabbat. It's an island. It's a paradise. It's bringing down heaven unto earth. And you do that by sanctifying, by creating the atmosphere of heaven on earth, as if it were a spiritual vacation every week. This is what we Jews have, a spiritual vacation. Shabbat Shalom.